Aaron Rodgers versus Jordan Love, the Giants versus the Eagles 2.0. Big changes are coming for the New York Jets. The San Francisco defense might actually be making a comeback, and that might not be good for the offense. And this week is Baltimore's last stand. It's week 8, and this is Fantasy Football Storytime. Let's kick things off with what will surely be the most talked about story of the week across all mainstream media: Green Bay versus Pittsburgh, Jordan Love versus Aaron Rodgers. There are about 1,000 ways to frame this story. The old veteran versus the new young talent that took his job. Will Aaron Rodgers get his revenge? Will Jordan Love prove that the Packers made the right choice? This is actually a very compelling matchup. Like, if we were talking about a revenge game while Rodgers was with the Jets, it wouldn't nearly be as interesting. That organization was a mess, dysfunctional, struggling, going nowhere. But this is a different scenario here. Because while many were skeptical of Mike Tomlin's vision in Pittsburgh and whether or not Aaron Rodgers would be the right fit for that system, it has turned out to be a perfect match. I'll admit, I was skeptical too. Rodgers has always preferred to be in control, to push pass volume, to be the superstar, while Pittsburgh's offense has leaned traditionally more conservative, favoring a more balanced approach, leaning heavily on the run. But the Steelers' run game has been excellent. They're winning, they're 4-2, and they're sitting atop of the AFC North. Now, of course, competition is coming. The Bengals have found life in Joe Flacco at quarterback, and then once Lamar Jackson returns, cross our fingers, we'll talk about this in a second, hopefully he will bring the Ravens back from the edge of destruction. Still, the Steelers look like a legitimate playoff contender. Now, on the other side, the Packers are clinging to the top of their division by a thread. The NFC North is just far more competitive, with 3 teams holding winning records and 1 sitting at 500. In full transparency, I am a Packers fan, but I can be objective here. Green Bay came out in week 1 and absolutely dominated the Lions, looking like a Super Bowl contender there. Before reality kind of set in, they're still a good team, but they're one that is still working through some issues there. Micah Parsons has clearly been a solid addition to the defense, but there is still room for improvement. Matthew Golden feels like he's on the cusp of a breakout every single week, yet he continues to hover around 10 fantasy points. The Packers still haven't committed to a true wide receiver 1, and at this point, you kind of wonder if they ever will. Regardless, we have got a matchup loaded with storylines, 2 teams atop of their divisions with playoff aspirations. This will absolutely be the game of the week. We have another compelling matchup this week, the Eagles versus the Giants 2.0. Rematches don't always go the exact same way they did the first time. This is critical for us from a fantasy perspective because we are trying to predict the outcome, and we can use the prior matchup as a baseline, especially when it was that recent as it was with this matchup. But teams try to make adjustments and try to counteract what worked well against them in the prior matchup. For example, we can look to the Chiefs versus the Eagles in week 2, the Super Bowl rematch there. In the Super Bowl, it wasn't Saquon Barkley that beat the Chiefs offensively, it was the pass. Kansas City has a strong run defense, so you would assume in the rematch you would get the same result. Nope. No, Kansas City, a team that is objectively harder to beat on the ground and easier to attack through the air, clamped down on the pass, and it was Saquon Barkley that had the more successful game from a fantasy perspective. Now, sometimes the counteracting doesn't work well if a team is truly just better what they do, but it is important to remember that we are just not duplicating results. In the first matchup, the Eagles and the Giants had in week 6, the Giants dominated, winning 34-17. From the Eagles' perspective, production was overall rather mediocre. Jalen Hurts did have a fine week from a fantasy perspective, and also from a real game perspective, completed 24 of 33 attempts for 283 yards, a nice high volume passing day for him, 1 passing touchdown, an interception, and of course, a rushing touchdown. Dallas Goedert was the big beneficiary of Hurts' volume, recording 9 receptions on 11 targets for 110 yards and a touchdown. A.J. Brown had a decent day with 6 receptions on 9 targets for 80 yards. Devonta Smith's production was modest. Saquon Barkley had another disappointing fantasy performance, his worst of the season before last week's game against Minnesota. Barkley is clearly on a downturn in production here. He has failed to exceed 100 rushing yards in any game this season, with the majority of them being under 50 yards. He is surviving on touchdowns. His efficiency has taken a major hit here. Now, the question we have here is, the Eagles will likely try to get him back on track in this matchup, but can they do that while maintaining the level of pass volume that they showed last week? Is trying to establish the run the better approach versus the Giants this week? On the Giants side, this matchup was all about Cam Skatteboo's breakout performance. He had 19 carries for 98 yards and 3 touchdowns, a truly dominating outing. Skatteboo is clearly the lead back here, although his snaps did decrease slightly last week in the return of Tyrone Tracy, but not a big deal there. Jackson Dart was very efficient in this original matchup, completing 17 of 25 attempts for just under 200 yards and a passing touchdown, while of course adding 13 carries for 58 yards and a rushing touchdown as well. Last week against Denver, Dart had a fantastic day. His rushing volume did dip below his usual 50-plus yard workload, but that is a common occurrence against the Broncos. Expect his usage on the ground to increase back again this week. In that first matchup, Wan'Dale Robinson had a fantastic game with additional contributions from Lil Jordan Humphrey. The Eagles bounced back well offensively last week, pushing volume aggressively through the pass once again. The Giants, again, they're coming off a very overall impressive performance against the Broncos, but unfortunately completely blew it at the end. A collapse that looked more like a coaching issue and not really a personnel issue. Can the Giants overcome that demoralizing loss there, or will the Eagles step up and beat them in this rematch? The Jets have officially named Tyrod Taylor as their starting quarterback. I'm not entirely sure what that is going to accomplish, but they did it, so we got to talk about it. Justin Fields was benched roughly halfway through the game after completing just 6 of 12 attempts for 46 yards. The prior week against Denver, he completed 9 of 17 attempts for 45 yards. Yeah, if you throw for less than 50 yards 2 weeks in a row, you're probably going to get your job taken away from you. Oddly enough, Fields has at least appeared to fix his turnover issues. He had no interceptions on the season and just 3 fumbles, but despite limiting the mistakes, he was still very inefficient in terms of passing volume, and when your team is constantly losing, that is kind of a requirement for the job. Taylor came in and somehow managed to look even worse than Justin Fields, completing just 10 of 22 passes for 126 yards and 2 interceptions. At this point, the Jets are just clearly trying to do anything to turn their season around. Unfortunately, I don't know that it can be salvaged, but we do still have to evaluate Taylor from a fantasy perspective because there are multiple fantasy assets that are tied to this offense and very critical to us. We are still unsure if Garrett Wilson will return this week, but the team said that it's not a long-term injury. Hopefully he is back this week. Since Taylor started in week 3 against Tampa Bay when Fields was out, we do have a 1-game sample size of Taylor and Wilson together. In that game, Taylor hyper-targeted Wilson. Yay. He caught 10 of 13 targets for 84 yards and a touchdown, his best performance of the season. Now, to be fair to Fields, Wilson also had very comparable stats with him under center as well. At this point, we've had enough information to safely say that while we would love Garrett Wilson to have a highly effective quarterback, he can produce no matter who is throwing the ball. Wilson's injury occurred late in week 6, so essentially he has played a full 6 games. In 4 of those 6 games, he scored at least 19 fantasy points in PPR each time, posting a minimum of 6 receptions and a touchdown. His only 2 games below double-digit fantasy points came in week 2 against Buffalo, 9 points, and week 6 against Denver, 4 points. That Denver game can be explained through tough coverage there. It is also worth noting that those 4 strong games came in very favorable pass matchups. Dallas, Miami, and Tampa Bay. The good news is that the upcoming schedule is fairly neutral, so when Wilson does return, he can still carry weekly top 10 upside regardless of who is at quarterback. We've talked about Breece Hall plenty. In short, as long as the matchup isn't terrible, Hall has maintained a relatively solid floor. Most of his games have landed between 9 and 17 fantasy points he is producing on the ground, and whoever leads this backfield will continue to do so with good fantasy value while adding receiving upside. The only real issue here is the lack of touchdown opportunities, and that probably is not going to change. But the main concern here for Hall is not any matchup, it's not any volume, it is the trade market. He appears to be one of the top names being discussed, and that is something that we have to continue monitoring because a trade could boost his value in a better situation while also elevating Isaiah Davis to a lead back role for the Jets. And yes, because we have 6 teams on a bye this week, Tyrod Taylor is technically a streaming option against a Cincinnati defense that is very vulnerable at times. I like operating on patterns, and one pattern that had become abundantly clear, we talked about it before, the 49ers defense has been absolutely wrecked with injuries and struggling to stop anyone. Things were so bad that even Spencer Rattler threw 3 touchdowns against them. We know what the issue was. It is no mystery. This isn't the same dominant unit we have seen in past years. They've lost players. And then losing Nick Bosa hurt. Quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, they were all teeing off against San Francisco. Then they had the loss of Fred Warner. Everything just seemed like it was going in a terrible direction. And as a result, the 49ers were no longer able to operate the way that they had previously on offense, built on extreme efficiency. Instead, they were forced to throw at a very aggressive rate, so much that they have the second most pass attempts in the NFL, and they were first in pass attempts before that volume dipped in week 7 against Atlanta. But the passing volume made their offense very predictable. Christian McCaffrey was thriving with at least 7 targets in every single game this season. Kendrick Bourne had emerged with strong upside. And even Jake Tonjes, filling in for George Kittle, was producing. But all of that came to a halt in week 7 when the San Francisco 49ers defense finally showed up. They limited Bijan Robinson on the ground. That was crazy. They frustrated Michael Penix Jr. They looked like an elite defense again. And that is critical because, again, if the defense can hold opponents in check, the 49ers no longer have to push extreme passing volume to stay competitive. And when that happens, their offense becomes far less reliable from a fantasy perspective outside of Christian McCaffrey. So the big question we have now is, was that defensive performance real, or was this just another very underwhelming performance from Michael Penix at quarterback? The matchup is excellent against a Chicago defense, and when Lamar Jackson is healthy, he consistently provides top 5 upside. His last game against Kansas City was subpar, and perhaps he could have turned it around if he had stayed in the game. But looking at weeks 1 through 3 against Buffalo, Cleveland, and Detroit, all tough defenses, Lamar Jackson had 9 passing touchdowns and 1 rushing touchdown and 0 interceptions. He was dealing despite the overall results on the field being less than desirable. The perception that the Ravens offense was struggling early in the season is a bit overstated. From a fantasy perspective, there were 0 issues with Lamar Jackson's production. If he comes back this week, he is an automatic start and moves up in rankings immediately. His return is also very critical for the entire offense, particularly Derrick Henry, who has struggled without him. While Henry is elite, right, his success on the ground does depend on game competitiveness because he doesn't have that receiving upside. Without Lamar Jackson and with the defense struggling before the bye week, it was very difficult for Derrick Henry to find consistent opportunities and goal line opportunities as well. One thing is for sure here. Despite the critics over the past couple of years claiming that Derrick Henry's arrival was the defining change in terms of Baltimore's offense, it is very clear that the heart of this team runs through Lamar Jackson, and they need to have a competent defense alongside him. The Ravens are currently 1-5, and they face a very steep uphill climb to get back on track, but ironically, it's very realistic that if Lamar Jackson returns this week, they could win 8 games and sneak into the playoffs. I'm not exaggerating. The remaining schedule includes Chicago, Miami, Minnesota, Cleveland, the Jets, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, New England, Green Bay. They could make a comeback here. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can find me across all social media platforms at It's Tera Time, so make sure that you are tuned in, subscribe, turn your notifications on because I am bringing you more fantasy football content and advice all season long. Every week I've got you covered with top waiver wire ads and stashes and live shows and Q&A where you can ask me any questions you have and so much more.